Hey guys, and welcome to our next installment of our Renaissance lecture series here. So, we know that the Renaissance started after the Middle Ages, between 1300 to 1600 is when we're talking about the time period. And like I told you guys before, all of history, one thing flows into the other. So, the Middle Ages, when they were to end, it really set us up for the Renaissance because people were beginning to want to get back to ancient Rome and ancient Greek things. They wanted to start learning again. And there's this whole idea of this rebirth of knowledge, and things like books and art and just, great things going on, a great rebirth in intellectual knowledge. And so that's what the Renaissance was all about. And we know that it actually began in Italy. And it began there because there were a lot of powerful merchants, one of the families being the Medici family, who ruled in Florence, which is in Italy, for over 300 years. Very powerful. And they really helped to build the Italian Renaissance into what it was. And we'll talk more about that when we start talking about the artists. But what the Renaissance was also about, one of the most important things about the Renaissance, was this term called humanism. So, an intellectual movement called humanism, it was actually at the heart of the Renaissance movement. And what it was is that it was this system of education, and it was a lot different than what had happened during the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, there was a lot of study, but that study was mainly about things surrounding the church. And usually, the only people who were learning at that point, the only people who were literate or could read, were men of the church. So, your priests and your monks. Well, now all of a sudden, we have a new intellectual movement, and it's humanism. And it's wonderful that it takes place in the heart of the Renaissance, because Renaissance, of course, means rebirth and learning. So it's basically the study, instead of just studying church subjects and reading about the church and just following the church. Now it's a study of worldly subjects. People are looking at things like grammar, history, poetry, and rhetoric again, rather than religious subjects. So it's really a return to learning about things outside of the church. That was what humanism was all about. So humanists really looked back to the ancient texts and cultures of the ancient Greeks and of the Romans, because they wanted to understand, how they could learn from those societies to increase their understanding of what was going on in the current time. So they kind of were looking back, and they were, saying these were two great civilizations, the Greeks and the Romans. So who better to tell us how to form our society and how to form our government and our politics and our art and our architecture than the ancient Greeks and the Romans? And humanists believed that education should stimulate the individual's creative powers. So there was a lot of, like I said, you're going to see a lot of artists come about, and you're going to see a lot of literature. Because why? Because humanism is all about creative powers. It's about unleashing these things. It's like looking back to the ancient Greeks and looking at Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, these great philosophers. And the humanists thought, we need to do that again. We need to, let the mind be free of all these things. So what we have here, okay, in the middle of humanism, there came this thing out of humanism and grew out of the Renaissance called the Renaissance man. All right, so Leon Battista Alberti, he says, a man can do all things if he will. So really, the term Renaissance man comes from the belief that men should embrace all knowledge and become skilled in all things. So not just one thing. They should know all about like literature and art, and architecture. So, for example, Alberti, who gave that quote there, he was an accomplished architect, painter, poet, scientist, mathematician, as well as a great horseman. So, he had many different skills. He was skilled in all things, many things, and he embraced knowledge. This is where the term Renaissance man comes from. And you guys are going to have an activity on the Renaissance man in your digital notebook as soon as we're done with this. So, some of the important humanists that you guys should know that came out of this time. First of all, there's this dude, right? Okay, so he's seen as being the original humanist, okay? And his name was Francesco Petrarch. And he basically assembled a library of Greek and Roman manuscripts that he had found, and he puts them to good use by studying them and by allowing other people to study them as well. He actually wrote, is most famous for writing what is called the Sonnets to Lara. And this is a series of 366 poems that he wrote from 1327 to 1368 about his love for Lara. What a lucky lady Lara was. Don't you think so, ladies? Somebody wrote all those poems about her. Petrarch did. And here's one of the things here from the Sonnets of Petrarch. Everything else, every thought, goes for and forever fades away into the recesses of time, and therein what remains is my soul's love for you. Man, that's deep, right? And he was writing from 1304 to 1374, but 366 poems to this chick, Lara. She must have been pretty amazing. I don't know. So then another one of our important humanists, and personally one of my favorites, is Niccolo Machiavelli from 1469 to 1527. He wrote this awesome book that if you ever get the chance to read it, you need to read this book. It's called The Prince. And basically what it does is it stressed the ends that justify the means, okay? Meaning that rulers needed to use whatever method necessary to achieve their goals. So it becomes like almost the Bible for a lot of rulers during this time, and not replacing the Bible, but it becomes, they're looking at it and they're like, okay, so we have to use any tactic that we need to use in order to get what we need to do for our people and for our country and for ourselves. And the ends always justified the means, okay? So in other words, wherever you end, okay, wherever they would end up, however they got there, it was justified because in the end they would get what they want. So whatever mean that they used to get there, it was okay. So if you ever get a chance, this is a very popular, literary work, and you should hopefully get to read that, especially if you ever take AP Euro with Miss Beck. Machiavelli, one of the things that he said out of his book, The Prince, the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Think about that. Just think about it, right? So you look at a ruler and you're not judging the ruler on himself, but how intelligent he is based on the people he surrounds himself with. It's a pretty good concept. So another of our important humanists is Baldassare Castiglione. From 1478 to 1529 is when he lived, and he actually wrote a thing called the Book of the Courtier. And that's about the ideal man and woman. And in case you don't know what a courtier is, these are the people who would go to court. So not court like we think of court, like, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble, I got a parking ticket, I'm going to court. All right, but people who would go to what is called like the king's court. So the king would hold court, meaning at his palace or at his castle, and there were people who were nobles, who were wealthy, and they would come there and they would just kind of wander around all day long talking to each other, okay? And they were known as courtiers. So Castiglione is writing about what the ideal courtier would be. In other words, who the ideal woman would be and who the ideal man would be. So, a quote from him, men demonstrate their courage far more often in little things than in great. So, in other words, men showed courage in little acts that they would do, maybe professing their love or something like that, more than in these, great, displays of everything. So this is where we are stopping for today. Now what you guys need to do is that you need to go over to your digital notebook and you need to go to page 4. Page 4 is all about Renaissance men, okay, or the Renaissance man and what that is. So please go to page 4, check that out, and I'll talk to you soon.